All right, let's dive into a super interesting period in Canadian history, the late 19th and 20th centuries. We're going to unpack how things like industrialization, urbanization, and all these crazy new technologies basically flipped Canadian life and identity on its head. And you've given us a ton to work with: briefing docs, study guides, FAQs, textbook excerpts, even a YouTube series. You're clearly ready to tackle this era, and we're here to help you make sense of it all.
It's wild to think how all those changes affected not just how Canadians live day to day, but also like what it actually meant to be Canadian.
Totally. It's kind of like exploring the DNA of modern Canada, the social structures, the economy, even anxieties we still deal with today. It all goes back to this time. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind a bit. Before the 20th century, Canada was a completely different place, right?
Absolutely. Imagine a Canada where everything revolved around fishing, logging, and farming. Skilled craftspeople, working from home or small workshops. Those cottage industries were the heart of the pre-industrial era.
It's like taking a time machine back to a world without mass production and factories. But then, boom, the Industrial Revolution hits, starting in Great Britain, and everything changes.
Exactly. The steam engine comes along and it's a game changer. Harnessing the power of steam to run all kinds of machinery leads to the rise of factories, and suddenly mass production becomes possible.
And that's where things get really interesting because factories need workers. You have this huge shift from skilled craftspeople working independently to people working on assembly lines doing the same tasks over and over.
Yeah, it totally changes the nature of work. The focus shifts to efficiency and output. Imagine going from crafting a whole shoe by hand to just attaching soles all day. That must have had a big impact on people's sense of purpose and pride in their work.
It's mind-blowing. We still talk about things like worker alienation and descaling today, especially with all the automation happening now. It's like these issues from back then are still relevant in the 21st century.
Right. And as those factories grew, so did the cities. People flocked to urban areas looking for jobs, which caused this huge wave of urbanization.
Okay, picture this. Cities overflowing with people, tons of new challenges popping up. I bet it got pretty chaotic pretty fast.
Definitely. Cities had to adapt, figure out how to handle this influx of people. That's where technologies like the streetcar came in. Suddenly, cities could expand outward, creating suburbs.
And the population numbers just exploded. Toronto, for example, went from just over 181,000 people in 1891 to over 5 million by 2004. That's a crazy jump. I can only imagine the growing pains.
It's hard to wrap your head around, right? And with that growth came overcrowding, sanitation problems, social unrest, problems that still exist in cities around the world.
Like history is giving us a preview of the challenges of modern urban life. But amidst all this change, you also have these amazing technological advancements. Cars, planes, radio. It's like stepping into a sci-fi novel.
It was a time of crazy innovation. Think about the car. At first, there was resistance. Can you imagine cars having to yield to horse-drawn carriages? But eventually, the car became a symbol of freedom and progress and completely changed how we thought about distance and travel. What do you think those first road trips across Canada were like?
Well, I found this story of a journalist who tried to drive across Canada in 1912. It took him 48 days. He had to deal with dirt roads, slat tires, all kinds of obstacles. Makes you appreciate the highway system we have now.
For sure. And then there's the airplane, initially used for bush flights, but quickly evolving to connect this massive country.
And then the radio. Instant communication. It's hard to imagine a world without it. It wasn't just entertainment, but also helped connect Canadians from coast to coast, sharing news and stories, creating a sense of national unity.
The radio was revolutionary, but it also sparked anxieties about cultural identity. With all those American radio shows flooding in, some worried that Canadian voices would get lost. Kind of reminds me of the discussions we have today about global streaming services and their impact on Canadian content.
It's so interesting how those historical echoes resonate today. But let's switch gears a bit and talk about women. Their voices were becoming more powerful during this time. Industrialization opened up new opportunities for women in factories and offices and challenged traditional gender roles.
Absolutely. And all those labor-saving devices at home gave women more free time. Their work during World War I really showed what they were capable of. It helped fuel a movement for social and political equality. When you were researching, did any figures from the women's rights movement stand out to you?
Melanie McClung. She was huge in the women's suffrage movement. She said, "Never retreat, never explain, never apologize, get the thing done and let them howl." Talk about a powerful statement.
She was a force of nature. Her efforts, along with so many other women, led to women getting the right to vote in federal elections in 1918. But the fight for equality didn't stop there.
Right. That's where the person's case comes in. Emily Murphy and the famous Five took on the very definition of persons in Canadian law, which at the time didn't include women. They argued that women were, in fact, persons and should have full legal and political rights.
They took their case all the way to the British Privy Council and won. It was a huge victory that opened doors for women to participate fully in Canadian political life. It's incredible to think about the ripple effects of their courage and determination.
It shows you the power of collective action and how individuals can spark monumental change. But this era was full of contrasts. The Roaring Twenties, with all its optimism and progress, gave way to the devastating Great Depression. Canada was plunged into economic hardship and social unrest. Factories closed, unemployment went through the roof, people lost everything. It must have felt like the world was falling apart.
It was a time of immense hardship. You see it in all the desperate letters written to the Prime Minister begging for help, families struggling to survive.
I came across a letter from a farmer who wrote, "I'm so worried on account of the children as we never have any vegetables except potatoes." It breaks your heart to think about what people went through. But even in this despair, there are stories of resilience.
Absolutely. A lot of Aboriginal peoples relied on their traditional ways of life, hunting, trapping, selling handicrafts to make it through. Their connection to the land and their cultural heritage gave them strength.
And the government's response to the Depression laid the groundwork for social safety nets we have today. Programs like old age pensions and employment insurance emerged, a shift in thinking about the government's role in supporting its citizens.
It was a recognition that in times of crisis, the government had a responsibility to help those in need, a perspective that's had a lasting impact on Canadian society.
Then, as if the Depression wasn't enough, World War II breaks out, a devastating conflict, but it ends up revitalizing the Canadian economy. Military production created jobs, and the post-war period saw a surge in prosperity.
The war, despite the horrors, also pushed the growth of social programs, like public health care, thanks to people like Tommy Douglas. It shows that even during the darkest times, positive things can happen.
Speaking of positive outcomes, we can't forget the baby boomers. Soldiers returned home, started families, leading to a population boom that shaped Canada for decades. Did you know that school enrollment in Canada basically doubled between 1945 and 1961?
It goes to show you how these historical events have long-lasting effects. One thing leads to another, and the consequences echo through generations.
Like a chain reaction, each event setting the stage for the next.
Exactly. And understanding these connections is how we can really grasp the complexities of Canadian history and its impact on the world we live in today. As we get deeper into this era, the impact of technology on Canadian identity really jumps out. It's this constant push and pull between embracing the new and holding on to what's familiar. It's a theme that keeps coming up throughout history.
It's like that thing we talked about with the radio. It connects Canadians across these massive distances.
Yeah.
But there's also that worry about being flooded with American programming.
Yeah.
That debate's still relevant today, isn't it, with streaming services?
Totally. This anxiety about keeping a distinct Canadian identity amidst these huge global forces is a thread that runs through the whole 20th century. How do we embrace new things without losing ourselves in the process? It's a constant question.
So how did Canadians deal with this? Did they try to resist all those technological and cultural changes?
Oh, there were definitely efforts to promote Canadian stories and perspectives. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, being created in 1936 is a perfect example, a direct response to worries about American dominance on the radio.
So the CBC was tasked with giving Canadians their own voice, their own platform. Did it work? Did it actually help foster a Canadian identity?
It's tough to say exactly how much impact it had, but the CBC has definitely played a huge role in shaping Canadian culture. It's giving Canadian artists, musicians, and storytellers a space to share their work. And this idea of pushing Canadian voices went beyond just radio. Look at the arts and literature from this time. There's a real movement to capture what it meant to be Canadian in this rapidly changing world.
It's like they were trying to define themselves, create their own space amidst all those outside influences. So not just rejecting everything new, but actively shaping their own narrative.
Exactly. It's this balancing act between being part of the global scene and celebrating what's local. This tension, this back and forth, is something Canadians still deal with today.
It's amazing how those themes from the past connect to today's issues. We're still wrestling with those fundamental questions about identity and belonging. But let's shift gears for a sec and picture life in those booming cities we talked about. What were the social dynamics like? I imagine it was exciting, but also tough to live in a Canadian city back then.
You're right. Cities were becoming incredibly diverse. People from all walks of life, all kinds of backgrounds, crammed in close together. It was a melting pot for sure. Opportunities and friction all mixed up.
Let's break that down. What kinds of opportunities did city life offer?
While cities were the centers of the economy, they offered way more jobs and chances to get ahead compared to rural areas. You also had access to education, cultural events, and a kind of anonymity that could be freeing.
So cities were like magnets for people wanting a fresh start, a new frontier within Canada itself.
In many ways, they were. But this super fast growth came with downsides, too.
Like what? I'm guessing overcrowding and poverty were big issues.
Huge. All those people put a strain on everything. Housing was scarce and often terrible, which led to slums and sanitation problems. And the gap between the rich and the poor became impossible to ignore.
So you had this stark contrast. Progress and prosperity on one side, poverty and hardship on the other. Progress often had a price tag.
True. And that's where social movements come in. Workers organized into unions to fight for better wages, safer working conditions, and a say in their lives.
The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 comes to mind, a classic example of workers from all kinds of industries coming together to demand fair treatment. They basically shut the city down.
Yeah, a major turning point in Canadian labor history showed the power of organized labor and the need for social reform. It paved the way for better workers' rights and the development of social safety nets. This realization that things could be better and that workers could make that happen.
We've talked about the struggles of workers and the fight for women's rights, but what about the experiences of Aboriginal peoples during this time? I feel like their story is often left out.
Right. It's a crucial part of the story that needs to be told. Sadly, for many Aboriginal communities, this period was marked by more marginalization and discrimination.
We touched on the government's policies to try and force Aboriginal peoples to assimilate. Can you explain that a little more?
The government implemented policies aimed at wiping out Aboriginal languages, cultures, and traditions. Residential schools are a tragic example of this, designed to forcibly assimilate Aboriginal children into Euro-Canadian culture. It's a dark chapter in Canadian history, and its effects are still felt in Aboriginal communities today.
It's heartbreaking. While Canada was transforming, many Aboriginal peoples were facing a different kind of change, one forced upon them, often with terrible results.
Exactly. It's a reminder that the experience of being Canadian during this time was different for everyone. Social class, ethnicity, gender, location, it all played a role. We can't paint the era with one brush. It's a mix of different experiences that all contribute to the bigger picture of Canada.
That's a great point. We have to look beyond the grand narratives and see the individual stories, the human impacts of these events. Speaking of individual stories, I can't help but think about all the human drama that unfolded during this time. People leaving their farms for a new life in the city. Soldiers in the trenches of World War I. Families struggling to survive the Depression. It's like an epic novel waiting to be written.
Totally. Behind all the historical facts and figures are countless stories of resilience, heartbreak, and hope. Those are the stories that really bring history to life.
Makes you wonder, what would it have been like to walk in their shoes? It's a good reminder that history isn't just dates and events, it's about people.
And understanding how these events affected real people is how we learn empathy and compassion, qualities that are so important in our world today.
It's all about making those connections, right? Connecting the past to the present, connecting individual stories to bigger trends, connecting what we know in our heads to what we feel in our hearts.
Right on. And that's what makes studying history so rewarding. It's a journey of discovery, always expanding our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
It's like putting together a puzzle that never really ends.
And that's what keeps it so interesting. There's always another piece to find, another connection to make, another layer to uncover. We focused on the challenges of this era, but we can't forget the amazing resilience and ingenuity of Canadians. Even with hardship, unrest, and global conflict, they found ways to adapt, to create, to build a better future. It's pretty inspiring.
It is. That resilience seems baked into Canadian identity, something to celebrate and learn from as we face the challenges of our time.
Absolutely. We've given you a lot to think about in this deep dive, a whirlwind tour of a period that really changed Canada. But remember, this is just the start. We've given you a framework, some key ideas, and themes to explore.
The real learning begins when you take this information and use it in your own research and understanding of Canada and its place in the world.
We hope you'll dig deeper, ask questions, and challenge assumptions. History isn't a bunch of facts set in stone, it's a conversation, a living process of interpretation and understanding.
It's about using the past to inform our present and shape our future.
Exactly. And I have no doubt that you, with your curiosity and drive to learn, will continue to unravel the amazing story of Canadian history.
Before we move on, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier. The impact of technology on Canadian identity. It's such a big theme throughout this whole period. That constant balancing act between embracing innovation and preserving cultural heritage.
It's fascinating, right? It's not just about the technology itself, but about the changes to culture that come with it. Think about how the car changed cities and towns, or how the radio changed the way people consumed information and entertainment.
It's like technology changes the world around us and inside us at the same time. And as we said before, this tension between the new and the old is something we're still dealing with.
Totally. Think about those conversations about the impact of social media on our relationships, or the influence of global streaming services on Canadian content. History is repeating itself, but with different technology and new challenges.
It's like looking in a mirror, but the reflection's a little distorted. So what are some key takeaways from looking at technology and Canadian identity? What can we learn from the past as we deal with this increasingly complex technological world?
One thing we learn is that new technology isn't neutral. It comes with both good and bad. It's up to us to think about the possible consequences of embracing those new technologies.
Being mindful, right? Weighing the benefits against the risks. What are we gaining and what are we losing? It's a question we should be asking ourselves all the time.
Exactly. Another important point is that technology can bring people together and pull them apart. The radio connected Canadians across vast distances, but it also sparked those concerns about the influence of other cultures.
We see that today with the internet and social media. We have access to information and connections like never before. But we also have echo chambers, misinformation, and harmful content. It's a double-edged sword.
For sure. It's complicated and there are no easy answers. But by understanding the history of these debates, we can approach them with more nuance.
So in this age of super fast technological change, what are some things we should remember? What can we learn from what Canadians went through during this period?
I think we need to be aware of how new technology might affect us. We need to be thoughtful about how we bring these technologies into our lives and how we can minimize the bad stuff.
It's not about saying no to all technology. It's about using it in a smart and deliberate way, being creators, not just consumers.
Exactly. We also need to play a role in shaping the future of tech. We can't just let it happen to us. We need to push for policies that promote ethical innovation and make sure that technology serves everyone.
We need to take an active role in shaping technology's future instead of just being shaped by it.
Yes. And that means getting involved, thinking critically, and being willing to challenge the way things are.
It's a big task, but I think Canadians have a history of stepping up to the plate. We've seen it again and again. The early labor unions, the fight for women's right to vote, the efforts to protect Canadian culture against global forces.
Totally. That spirit of resilience, innovation, and working towards a better future, it's ingrained in who we are as Canadians.
It's something we can all find inspiration in as we face the challenges of the 21st century. It's about remembering where we came from, understanding the struggles and the wins of those who came before us, and using that knowledge to build our future. As we wrap up our deep dive into this really important period in Canadian history, I want to leave you with something to think about. We talked about how industrialization, urbanization, and all that crazy technological change really reshaped what it meant to be Canadian. But what does Canadian identity even mean after all that?
Ooh, that's a great question. And it's one that, historians and Canadians themselves have been wrestling with forever. Is there one single Canadian identity, or is it more about all these different overlapping identities based on where you're from, what language you speak, your culture, your experiences?
Yeah, it's a tough one. We've seen how different groups like women, workers, Aboriginal peoples all went through this time in different ways. Their struggles, wins, contributions, they all add to this tapestry of Canadian identity. No easy answers.
Right. And it's important to remember that Canadian identity isn't static. It keeps changing. We're always having conversations about inclusion, reconciliation, and, Canada's place in the world.
That's a key takeaway, isn't
Yeah.
it? This idea of identity as a process, a conversation, like we're all figuring it out together. It's not a destination, but a journey.
Perfectly said. And this deep dive, it's given you a good starting point to keep exploring that journey. You've gotten some insights into those forces that shaped Canada, like from the late 1800s to the 1900s, the economic changes, the tech, social movements, those political debates. A lot to process.
We've covered a lot of ground for sure, but hopefully we've sparked your curiosity to, learn even more.
That's the goal,
Hmm.
because the story of Canada, it's your story. Understanding the past is how you can make sense of the present and create the future you want to see. You're part of this bigger narrative.
So keep asking questions, keep digging, don't take anything for granted. And remember, this quest to understand what it means to be Canadian, it's an adventure. We're all in it together.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder this fascinating journey we call Canadian history. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.